Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, hope you're all doing well. So, it's going to be a bit of a different video today. So, as you can tell by the title, I'm going to be sort of resurrecting my retrospective boxing series. And I do have a bunch of regular career retrospectives that I've been planning to do for a while. And when I find the time to edit and record those, I'll certainly get down to it. Because I've been kind of neglecting this channel lately, and there's been a lot of ideas that I've had in concept that I just didn't really get down to producing. And I don't really want to abandon things. I want to kind of resurrect some old ideas and old concepts, and I'm kind of in the right mindset to do it right now. For today's video, however, it's going to be a bit more of a laid-back format than I usually use for these kinds of videos, because I'm not necessarily reviewing or auditing a particular fighter's record and speculating how they would do in other areas or anything like that. Today I just want to get a few things off my chest and discuss something that's been on my mind for a while. So let me know in the comments if you want to see more videos like this, of this kind of format, with me just basically talking about boxing history and, giving my opinions on it and whatnot, but really not having any sort of structure to it. Let me know what you think in the comment section, because I do have a lot of ideas for things like this in mind. But yeah, whatever, I digress. So, since Alexander Usyk's victory over Tyson Fury in the rematch last year, there has been a lot, and I do mean a lot, of heated debates and heated discussions back and forth on social media, as well as the mainstream boxing media, about Usyk's place in heavyweight history. And I've started to notice that a lot of boxing hipsters, hardcores, and general old school boxing heads are starting to become quite adamant that Usyk isn't an all-time great, which for obvious reasons is laughable, since he's done what literally no heavyweight in history has ever done before, and done it in such a short space of time, with such a small amount of developmental fights and professional experience. And I'm sure I don't need to tell my audience how proven Usyk is at this point, and how obvious it is that he's a certified all-time great. That's not the issue here, and it's not the topic of this video. I'm just bringing it up because it's relevant. Point being, all the discussions I've been hearing back and forth lately have inspired me to make a video of my own personal top 10 greatest heavyweight champions of all time. I'm going to be making that video at some point in the near future, but before I do, I really want to take my time with it and do a bunch more research, as well as watch a lot more classic fights and stuff like that. Because if I'm going to make a video like that, I really want to do it properly and not half-arse it. I want to come up with a genuine, authentic list that for me will be somewhat definitive, where I can properly articulate and justify my arguments for the placements of each fighter and stuff like that. So I really want to take my time with that video and take it seriously and make it with a certain amount of class. Today, however, I want to talk about Larry Holmes, and just him specifically, because Larry Holmes is a fighter that, for as long as I've known about him, he has always fascinated me for several reasons. So while doing my early research for the top 10 video, I've been watching a lot of random heavyweight fights from different eras, and the era I decided to start with was an era of heavyweight boxing that doesn't really seem to get talked about nowadays, but in my personal opinion is one of the pivotal eras in boxing, where a lot of the modern techniques that we see nowadays started to really get refined. You'll hear a lot of people talk about the 1930s to the 1950s, kind of Joe Louis' era and Rocky Marciano's era, as well as the eras that preceded it, like the 60s and 70s, Muhammad Ali's era, basically. Those eras always seem to get looked at with rose-tinted glasses, whereas the era that came right after, the late 70s and early 80s, is an era that you very rarely hear talked about nowadays. And I think it's safe to say that the dominant heavyweight champion of that era was Larry Holmes. And as I talked about on my most recent live stream, as some of you already know, Larry Holmes wasn't that well liked from the American boxing media, and there were a few reasons for this. And he's a guy who was always kind of regarded by the media as a lesser version of Muhammad Ali. If you watch some of his early fights, and listen to the commentators, they always referred to him as a guy who copied Ali, copying his style and mannerisms and all that good stuff. Basically, all through his career, he was seen as a cheap imitation of Ali. Again, as I mentioned on that live, I never agreed with this narrative. In fact, based on the research I've done about Larry Holmes, and what I've gathered from watching and analysing his fights, the best way I can describe him is to say that he is the guy that they say Muhammad Ali was. What do I mean by this? The next part of the video is going to be a bit controversial, since Ali is one of these people who's kind of a mythical figure in boxing. You speak to any mainstream boxing historian, and all they do is bloviate about how great Ali was, how unbeatable he was in his prime, how ahead of his time he was, blah blah blah. He's the best thing since sliced bread. Nobody in the history of combat sports, before or ever since, could beat him. I exaggerate, of course, but you get the picture. They bloviate about Ali so much that if you even as much as suggest that someone from another era could beat him or might have been better than him, they get genuinely offended and butthurt by it, which never made any sense to me, because I gotta be honest, as far as I'm concerned, as good as Ali was, and he was good for his time, and he had a lot of attributes he could lay claim to, he wasn't perfect, and he wasn't invincible, far from it. There are a lot, and I mean a lot of myths about Ali, things that were just flat out untrue that he got credit for. To highlight some of the things Ali did have, he had a great chin, he was a very, very tough and durable man, he was a pretty good athlete with very good stamina, fast hands, fast feet and quick reflexes, and he was a fighter who would often use these attributes to outlast his opponents, many of which were smaller, slower, and less athletically gifted than he was. Most of the heavyweights from the 60s to the early 70s were basic, one-dimensional sluggers who relied on their toughness and power a little bit too much. A lot of them were shorter than Ali, a lot of them were slower than Ali, and Ali just had physical attributes that weren't very common in those days. You know, you didn't often see a fighter with his kind of style. However, if you look at some of the narratives you often hear about Ali, people say he was a master tactician with an amazing boxing IQ that was just unmatched before or since, that he had one of the greatest, if not the greatest jab in boxing history, that he had some of the most amazing, if not the most amazing footwork in boxing history, that he was an intellectual genius who never got hit and just couldn't possibly lose in his prime. All of this is flat out nonsense. First of all, Ali was never much of a technician. He was a guy who relied primarily on physicality and heart. He never had a good defense, which is why he got hit over and over again in fights, so much so that by his late 30s he had severe brain damage and could barely string a sentence together. He never had a great jab, throwing mostly slappy, cuffing punches, and his footwork was awful and he was always off balance. He had fast feet, yes, but his balance and lateral movement was nothing to write home about. He was a fighter who relied on athleticism and physicality, as well as the limitations of his era, rather than tactical skills. Larry Holmes, on the other hand, as far as I'm concerned, he is the guy they claim Ali was, and he started to gain prominence in an era of heavyweight boxing that was starting to seriously advance. And not only that, but he continued to compete and develop as a fighter decades after that era was over. Before I go any further, I want to make one thing very clear right off the bat so nobody gets confused. As you can tell by the title, I'm asking the question, was Larry Holmes the greatest heavyweight champion ever? Right off the bat, while I don't personally think he was the greatest heavyweight ever, I do think an argument could be made that he was, and I'll go into detail about this. So what fascinates me about Larry Holmes when I watch this guy, and I've been watching a lot of his fights lately from different stages of his career, a lot of his more significant fights, and what fascinates me about him, if you look at the way that this guy would fight, now he came around in the late 70s, I'd say he was in his prime from the very late 70s to the early 80s. I believe he first won a title in 1978 or something like that. That was when he started fighting at world level. Larry Holmes was a guy who did things that you just flat out didn't see from heavyweight boxing from the time. And you'll notice that a lot of his opponents during his reign as champion, they were starting to fight a lot more sophisticated than a lot of guys from the previous era. Now, when he first got his title shot, he had an eliminator against Ernie Shavers. Now, Ernie Shavers, by that stage of his career, was a veteran. He was a guy who had had almost 50 pro fights, been around a very long time. He'd fought the likes of Muhammad Ali and gave him a very tough fight and lost a close fight on points. And he was a guy who was a very, very heavy-handed, strong, big-punching guy. Had kind of a bodybuilder physique. He wasn't the most technically skilled fighter. He wasn't the best athlete. Just a big, strong, tough, rugged, heavy-handed puncher. Now, at that stage of his career, he was considered past his prime, because he'd had a long career at that point, and he didn't really have that long left. But me personally, and some people might disagree with this, but when I look at Ernie Shavers from that stage of his career, when I believe he was about 33 years old, and when I compare that to the younger Ernie Shavers, in my opinion, Ernie Shavers was a lot better at that stage of his career. I think as he got older, he started to rely on his power a little bit less, and he started to develop a bit of head movement, a little bit of feints, and he started to learn a little bit more about how to apply pressure to his opponents. And when he fought Larry Holmes, I actually thought, despite the fact that Ernie Shavers lost and lost convincingly, I actually think he looked better in that fight than he had previously. Now, that obviously wasn't enough. Larry Holmes, who I believe had had about 26 fights at that point and hadn't really fought anybody significant, he was just a sort of a fringe contender at that stage of his career. He went into that fight with more experience and more advancement than his record would suggest, because he was a guy who was kind of brought up as a sparring partner for some of the championship level guys of the time. He sparred numerous rounds with Muhammad Ali, he'd sparred rounds with Joe Frazier, and he was just a guy who they kind of brought in as an awkward, elusive target who was very, very good for sparring. But when he got that Ernie Shavers fight, that was his coming out party. That was when he really announced himself on the world stage, because he not only upset the odds there, but he absolutely schooled, dominated and humiliated Ernie Shavers. And watching that fight is fascinating. So what you'll see is Ernie Shavers trying to apply pressure to Larry Holmes, kind of like he was able to do in spots to Muhammad Ali. Larry Holmes is in a side profile. Now, you'll hear me talk about this from time to time on my channel, how one of the first things they'll teach you in an amateur boxing gym nowadays is they'll teach you to get into a side profile to present a smaller target for your opponent. And you'll see that Larry Holmes does this to Ernie Shavers. Larry Holmes is able to get foot position on Ernie Shavers immediately in the first round. And unlike Muhammad Ali, who would often bounce around the ring, waste energy and end up getting trapped on the ropes, Larry Holmes never needs to go to the ropes because he has absolutely fantastic lateral movement. Larry Holmes' lateral movement is beautiful. And bear in mind, this is the early stage of his career before he'd really fought anybody of note. And he dominated every single round. Ernie Shavers couldn't land a significant punch the entire fight. Larry Holmes just moved around him, pumped the jab in his face, kept him under control. And what was fascinating about it too was that despite the fact Shavers was significantly stronger and was the significantly bigger puncher, Larry Holmes' timing and anticipation and his overall confidence was so great that he was able to stand in the pocket with Ernie Shavers and was able to slug it out with him. He was able to bend at the waist and throw uppercuts to the head, uppercuts to the body. He would step to the side, make Ernie Shavers miss with one of his big swinging hooks, and catch him between his guard with a lead uppercut and things like that. And I just thought it was a really, really masterful performance from Larry Holmes, and one of the most to me, it's one of the most interesting fights from that era to watch. So he beat Ernie Shavers, who again went into that fight with a huge advantage in terms of experience and in terms of power. And the fight was not close, it was not competitive at all. Then he got the title shot against Ken Norton. Now, Ken Norton was kind of a similar level of fighter to Shavers, at least in terms of his record on paper. You know, he's a guy who had fought at world level for years. He was kind of a veteran in the sport, maybe a little bit past his prime. But he had fought 3 hard fights with Muhammad Ali, beaten him clearly 3 times, but didn't get the decision. He did get destroyed by George Foreman, but there's really no shame in that. But aside from all that, you know, Ken Norton was kind of one of the top guys at that stage of his career, you know, in the late 70s. He was a guy who had managed to pick up a title, and, you know, he kind of refined his skills a little bit. He was a little bit more defensively gifted and a little bit more tactful, I'd say, than he was earlier in his career. Again, that's why I compare him to Ernie Shavers. I think the two guys were both a little bit improved technically at that stage. But again, Larry Holmes goes in there, and because he has such great lateral movement, because he has such a great jab, he's able to school and dominate Ken Norton in the first half of that fight. Now, to his credit, Ken Norton picked up the pace in the later rounds, and Larry Holmes, and this is something I'll talk about later with Larry Holmes, he had the tendency to get a little bit sloppy, get a little bit cocky and careless, and sometimes he would clown around a little bit too much, and this would get him caught. It would get him in a compromised position and things like that, and he made a few mistakes in the later rounds of the Ken Norton fight. One thing I forgot to mention was that the Ernie Shavers fight was a 12-rounder, whereas the Ken Norton fight was obviously a title fight. It was a 15-rounder. Now, had the Ernie Shavers fight been a 12-rounder or been a 15-rounder, I think Larry Holmes would have stopped him. Because at the very end of the 12th round, Shavers was hurt, he was badly out on his feet, you know, he was a sucker for the uppercut, and Larry Holmes was starting to really open up on him, and it looked like he was going to get him out of there. But of course the bell went and saved Ernie Shavers from a stoppage. Going into his next fight, the fight against Ken Norton, Larry Holmes actually really struggled in the last 3 rounds, because in the mid-rounds he used up so much energy and threw a lot of real explosive bursts of punches that he really was starting to get sloppy towards the end. So that was his first time going 15 rounds, and although he'd won the fight clearly and convincingly, it was a fight where he really had to show a gut check. You know, he really had to tough his way through the last few rounds, and I thought that Larry Holmes in that fight showed the makings of an all-time great heavyweight, because not only did he have the fantastic lateral movement, great footwork, great balance, the ability to stand in the pocket and throw bombs and bend at the waist and slip shots and rely on his reflexes and stuff like that. Not only did he show all that stuff, but he also showed championship heart, and he showed the ability to kind of pace himself and manage his stamina over 12 rounds. And it's interesting to me because if you look at his other title shots in the aftermath of winning the title against Norton, he started to become a much more complete fighter. You know, his next couple of title defenses after that, he fought some fringe contenders, had some brutal knockouts. Like one of his fights, he dropped the guy 4 times and, you know, had the commentators begging him to stop the fight. And going into the 80s, it became very, very clear that Larry Holmes was the dominant heavyweight champion, that this guy was maybe even a pound-for-pound level fighter. Now, eventually, sometime down the line, he fought Muhammad Ali, and this is a fight that really rubs a lot of people up the wrong way, because it has to be said that Muhammad Ali, at that stage of his career, probably shouldn't have been fighting. I mean, he was starting to show signs of brain damage at that point. Again, as I mentioned before, Ali had no defense. He got hit all the time, and yeah, his style really wasn't that long-lived. But going in against Larry Holmes, it was interesting because I revert back to the narrative that I was talking about before, how Muhammad Ali is seen as this elite tactician, you know, this technical genius, this, that, and the other, and how Larry Holmes is supposedly just an inferior imitation of him. Now, had that been true, if you have Muhammad Ali in his late 30s, past his prime, and clearly declined physically. And then you've got a younger, less experienced, champion in Larry Holmes, a guy who's still on the way up, who's still got a lot of time left in the sport, who's still in his 20s. You would at very, very least, if that narrative was true, assume that the fight would be close and competitive, because you would assume that Muhammad Ali, being a master tactician, would be able to compensate for his physical decline and use those superior skills and that superior ring IQ to at least win some rounds and occasionally get the better of Larry Holmes. But that isn't the case. Larry Holmes went in there and not only beat Muhammad Ali, but he utterly schooled and dominated Ali, won every single second of every single round, put an absolute beating on the guy, and essentially forced him to quit. He was the first guy who ever forced a stoppage over Muhammad Ali officially. I know Henry Cooper really should have, but yeah, Larry Holmes was the first guy to officially do it. And like I said, you have to take into consideration the stage of Ali's career that he was at. He was definitely past his prime and showing serious signs of decline. But had the narrative been true that Ali was the more superior technician of the two, that wouldn't have mattered as much as it did, because he would have at least made the fight close and competitive. When Tyson Fury fought Vladimir Klitschko, in my opinion, that's two all-time great heavyweights. One guy who was in his physical prime, but nowhere near as experienced, and the other guy who was almost 40 years old, right at the end of his career, but had bags of experience. That fight was competitive. Vladimir was able to cut off the ring on Fury. He was able to back him up all night. He was able to land his jab here and there. He was able to limit Fury's offense. Fury just had to basically use his height and reach, his movement, his feints, and his superior foot speed, being the younger, fresher fighter, who had much quicker feet then. He had to really use that to outwit Vladimir and just outpoint him in a very close fight. It wasn't a complete whitewash. It wasn't a complete domination. It was a very close and competitive fight. Larry Holmes versus Muhammad Ali, which was a similar dynamic in terms of the level of their careers the guys were at, was not close. It was not competitive. Larry Holmes separated himself from Muhammad Ali. In my personal opinion, I don't think Ali would have ever beaten Larry Holmes, because in my personal opinion, Larry Holmes did everything better from a technical and strategic point of view. I've talked about Larry Holmes' jab already. Now, one of the things that was great about Larry Holmes' jab, and you can see this all through his career, he was very, very versatile with the jab. One of the things that you would see from Larry Holmes' jab is that he'd be able to throw it from different places. Like, he would throw it from the guard sometimes, he would throw it from the chest, sometimes he would throw it from the hip, he would throw it as sort of a screw shot, sometimes he'd even throw it over his opponent's right hand. He would often change the trajectory of it. He would motion like he was going to throw it one way but throw it another way. He would sometimes bend at the waist or jump up in the air so that he could throw it to a different part of the body, like the torso or the chest. He would just always use that jab in such a variety of ways. He would switch up the speed on it, and he had such a great nose for finding out how to land the jab. He would use that long reach to kind of slap down his opponent's glove. Sometimes he would even just put his hand out there, not touch the opponent, just have it near the opponent to measure them up, and to also obscure the opponent's vision and disguise what his next punch was going to be. Like, sometimes he would just poke his rear right hand towards his opponent's chin, not really throw it, and then throw the jab. Likewise, he would sometimes do it, then throw a lead uppercut. Like, Larry Holmes was so creative in the way that he would create openings for his offense that I don't think I'd ever seen anything like it from that era. Like, it's honestly fascinating. And, you couple that with his lateral movement, his ability to bend at the waist, the fact that when he was confident enough in a fight to take the fight to his opponent, he would just stand there flat-footed with his hands down, and when his opponent went to throw a punch, he would just lean back and then counter. Something that a lot of these Cuban fighters do. Although Larry Holmes, in my opinion, did it a lot more tactfully, because he wouldn't do it unless he had his opponent completely under control. Like, you would see him laughing at his opponent sometimes. Like, sometimes, like I said, he'd be moving around the ring. Sometimes he would bounce around, just sticking the jab out, just feinting. But when he felt like his opponent was starting to weaken, or he was starting to time his opponent, he would literally just stand there right in front of them, and more often than not, they couldn't hit him, and he was able to bend at the waist and hit them with uppercuts to the body. He kind of reminds me of Tyson Fury in the early part of his career. He used to do something similar. He also kind of reminds me, weirdly enough, of a fighter like Sultan Ibragimov, if you remember him. He used to do this too. He'd stand in front of his opponent with his lead hand down, and then when his opponent would throw a punch, he'd lean back and then throw the rear hand to the body. Like, Larry Holmes was one of the first fighters to do that successfully, I think, at least in the heavyweight division. So, yeah, Larry Holmes, like I said, he came around in the late 70s, dominant heavyweight champion into the 80s, and the vast majority of his fights were not competitive. If you look at some of the other fights Larry Holmes had throughout the 80s, he was able to beat several solid contenders from the time, and guys who are still looked back on with a lot of credit to this day. For example, he has that knockout victory over Jerry Cooney. That was one of his most famous title defenses. It was kind of an ugly fight, competitive fight, but ultimately Larry prevailed in the end and forced a stoppage. One of his best performances, in my opinion, and this is a fight that I like to watch, that really highlights what I've been talking about in regards to Larry Holmes' technical ability, was his fight against Tex Cobb. Now, Tex Cobb was one of these guys, he wasn't the most technically gifted fighter, but he was a very, very big, strong, powerful, tough guy with a granite chin and a heck of a lot of heart. He actually knocked out Ernie Shavers in the back end of his career and had to walk through a lot of big punches to do so. So that was a very, very difficult challenge for Larry Holmes at the time, given who Tex Cobb was. He was a bigger guy, stronger guy, fantastic chin. And if you look at that fight, that's one of the prime examples to me of a masterclass in boxing. Like, Larry Holmes just circled the guy all night, beat the absolute piss out of him, gave him one of the most one-sided beatings you'll ever see. It kind of reminded me of Vladimir Klitschko when he fought Marius Vac, if you remember that fight. Again, he just circled him all night, hitting him with bombs from long range, controlling him with the jab. Every second of every round was just completely one-sided. And to me, that showed that Larry Holmes, when he needed to be, when he was switched on and focused, he could be a very, very consistent fighter over 15 rounds. And that stands out as one of his better performances to me. Not because of who the opponent was, just based on how disciplined he was and how easily he controlled every single second of the fight. I mean, the fight was so one-sided that the commentator for the fight actually threatened to quit if it wasn't stopped. He was like, I can't cover boxing anymore if it's going to be like this. It was actually quite dramatic. So yeah, he had those wins. He had some kind of lower level wins, like he had that first round knockout win over Marvis Fraser. He was able to beat several other contenders, and inexplicably in the mid-80s, he lost his title in a shocking upset in a very close and controversial decision to Michael Spinks. Now, this is where Larry Holmes' career starts to kind of fall off the rails a bit, and for the rest of his career, it's kind of up and down. He had a lot of ups, a lot of downs, a lot of strange performances, and in my personal opinion, this is where kind of the controversy comes as to where you would rank Larry Holmes as an all-time great heavyweight. This is where some of the arguments in his favour start to fall apart. But what I find very, very interesting about Larry Holmes in the latter part of his career is that despite the fact that for the vast majority of it, he looked like he didn't train. He showed up to fights in absolutely horrendous condition. I think after the Michael Spinks controversy, he was never really the same again in terms of consistency and athleticism. But he never really lost that boxing IQ or that technical ability, because all of his losses were very close. All of them were somewhat controversial. And you could argue that he won all of those fights. Now, if you look at the loss that really stands out on his record, now this is the one that people always bring up when they talk about Larry Holmes not being an all-time great, some of his detractors, and it's a fair argument. They'll talk about his defeat to Mike Tyson. Now, the defeat to Mike Tyson was a particularly bad defeat, it has to be said. Not necessarily because he lost to Mike Tyson, because there's no shame in losing to Mike Tyson, especially if you are at the stage of your career that Larry Holmes was at. But me personally, and this is going to be another controversial statement, because just like Muhammad Ali, Mike Tyson is very, very well loved by the boxing hipsters and the sort of old school boxing head community. But in my personal opinion, that fight was a bit of a fluke. Now, if you look at what the situation was going into that fight, not only was Larry Holmes in horrendous shape for that fight, not only was he coming off of a 2-year layoff, as well as 2 back-to-back losses, fights that took a lot out of him, fights that he really could have won had it been scored a different way. I think that they really, really did something to Larry Holmes' motivation and confidence, and for all intents and purposes, he was considered retired, but basically financial issues and stuff like that lured him out of retirement. And there's actually quite an interesting story about the build-up to the Mike Tyson fight. Essentially, Don King kind of swindled Larry Holmes into taking the fight on short notice and not really giving him enough time to train. So when Larry Holmes showed up to that fight, he clearly hadn't done any sparring, he clearly hadn't prepared, he was in awful shape, and Mike Tyson kind of just caught him cold, in my opinion, jumped all over him, overwhelmed him quickly with power and pressure, and in my personal opinion, it's just a perfect example of perfect timing. I think Mike Tyson just caught Larry Holmes on a really bad night. Again, he caught him coming off of a 2-year layoff and 2 close losses that really demoralised him, and I just think he got him at the right time. So that's a loss on Larry Holmes' record that really stands out, and it's one that a lot of people who would really detract from him being the greatest heavyweight of all time would often bring up. It was a mostly circumstantial loss. I don't think he would have lost to Mike Tyson several years earlier. I don't think he would have lost in such one-sided fashion had he had a full training camp and if he was in better shape. So yeah, the Mike Tyson fight happened. He lost the fight. It was a bad defeat. But interestingly enough, despite the fact that the majority of boxing pundits at the time assumed that that was basically it, they would assume that he would be relegated to journeyman level, because 3 losses in a row, and, that's a really, really difficult ask to come back from. But several years later, with basically just a few easy, low-level comeback fights, he got a shot at the undefeated Ray Mercer. Now, Ray Mercer was coming off his probably career-best victory over Tommy Morrison for the WBO title, where he had that spectacular knockout. And Ray Mercer, of course, was an Olympian, a guy who had an extensive amateur background, was pretty much in his prime, and a lot of people would have logically favoured him to probably knock out Larry Holmes, given what happened against Mike Tyson. But in a surprisingly impressive and inspired performance, Larry Holmes actually completely schooled and dominated Ray Mercer and beat him on points over 12 rounds in a pretty one-sided fight. Very, very impressive comeback. And it showed that despite being out of shape, despite being in the later part of his career, Larry Holmes was still around. He was still a genuine contender. And he still had his boxing IQ, still had his jab, still had great lateral movement, and he still had a lot to bring to the table. He then got a title shot against Evander Holyfield, who at that point in time was undefeated, unified heavyweight champion, a guy who had come up from cruiserweight after becoming undisputed, and who was probably at his prime physically. And although it was a losing effort, if you look at that fight, Larry Holmes gave Holyfield a very, very tough fight, very competitive fight, made it the distance, won several rounds, and lost by a very close decision. And I think, again, that's more of a circumstantial loss. I think Larry Holmes, in shape, in his prime, probably would have handily beaten a guy like Holyfield. Again, it's just that Holyfield got him at the right time. He had another very, very close and controversial loss to Oliver McCall for a heavyweight title. You know, that was another fight that could have gone either way. A lot of people thought he won, but he was unlucky not to get it. And again, this is very, very late on in his career when he's already in his 40s. And the fact that he's still able to outbox a guy like Oliver McCall, go 12 rounds with him and give him one of his tougher title defenses, I think that's quite impressive. And a couple of years after that, he got another title shot, this time for the IBO title. So you kind of see at this stage of Larry Holmes' career, he's in his 40s, he's badly out of shape, but he's still deemed good enough to fight for titles. And every single one of his title opportunities is close and competitive, and some would say controversial. And the guy that he fought for the title was another undefeated guy, Brian Nielsen, over in Denmark. Now, that's a fascinating fight. I actually just got done watching that fight recently, and that's a fight that most people consider to be a robbery. Brian Nielsen won the fight officially by split decision, and me personally, and I'm going to give Brian Nielsen the benefit of the doubt here, but when I watched that fight, I actually thought it was a fair decision, although I will concede that the better punches of the fight were landed by Larry Holmes. Larry Holmes landed the cleaner, more effective punches, definitely was the more accurate of the two, and had the better technique of the two. The problem is that Larry Holmes for that fight was in such bad shape. You know, he was so overweight and underprepared that he was just flat out lazy. And Brian Nielsen, who was kind of a big, clumsy heavyweight, but a guy who had a lot of heart and threw a lot of punches, Brian Nielsen just outworked him. And I actually thought Brian Nielsen, being the aggressor, backing Larry Holmes up to the ropes, I believe he was also the champion going in. I believe he deserved to hold on to his title personally. I don't think it was a robbery, because although Larry Holmes did land the better punches of the two, and he definitely, without a shadow of a doubt, would have won the fight in his prime, I just don't think he was busy enough to take the title. So I personally thought that was a fair decision, but again, the fact he's going the distance against a big guy and a big puncher like Brian Nielsen, and he's going into his backyard and giving him one of his toughest fights of his career up until that point. Very, very commendable and very, very impressive, if you ask me. Now, I've kind of fast-tracked to this part of the video because I really think, and this is going to sound funny, it's going to sound like I'm talking rubbish, but I'm really not. And what am I going to talk about? So, right at the end of Larry Holmes' career, now I mentioned earlier that this guy fought for several decades. He actually fought well into his 50s. For his final professional fight, which took place in 2002, he was, I believe, 52 years old. Now, the fight that he had for his final fight, he took on Butterbean. Now, the Butterbean fight versus Larry Holmes, that's the kind of fight that nowadays we would call a freak show fight. Okay, it was kind of a freak show fight from the early 2000s, but it was the kind of freak show fight that had a lot of merit to it. And the reason why I say that is because it was an interesting curiosity. Nobody was under any illusions going into that fight about the level of fight it was and about how intriguing it was or wasn't. Now, what made that fight very intriguing is the fact that you had two guys completely opposite backgrounds, completely different levels in terms of their ability as fighters. But what made it interesting was Larry Holmes, at that stage of his career, like I said, 52 years old, badly out of shape, badly overweight, right on the verge of retirement. At that point, he'd been out of the ring for nearly 2 years, actually, and he was just looking for one last payday. So that made the fight more intriguing, because Butterbean, as I'm sure anybody watching this video knows, everybody knows who Butterbean is. He was a guy who kind of came through the tough man circuit. He was a tough man champion, somebody who competed in many of those contests. The tough man contests in America are what we in the UK would equate to, say, the unlicensed boxing scene. It's essentially people who aren't professional boxers, they don't have a license to compete professionally, but they want to have a go anyway, so they go into the ring and have a tear up, and they kind of know their level. It's unlicensed boxing. That was the scene that Butterbean came from, but Butterbean was so heavy-handed and so tough and so charismatic and was able to gain such a following that, of course, he was able to turn professional, which is something a lot of fighters from the tough man scene could never even dream of doing. And he was a guy who made a name for himself as a 4-round fighter. The vast majority of the fights that Butterbean had in his career were all over 4 rounds, and that's because he was under no illusions of the level of fighter he was. He knew he was just he wasn't a professional world-class boxer. He never claimed to be a world-class boxer. He was just a tough guy, a short, chubby, fat guy with a decent enough chin, a whole lot of heart, and a lot of power in both hands. So he was the kind of guy who had sort of a kamikaze attitude towards the sport. So he would go in there, regardless of who it is he's fighting, regardless of the style. He's not going to try and box you. He's not going to have much of a game plan. He's just going to go in there and swing for the fences, and either you get him or he gets you. And at 4-round level, where he's fighting essentially cab drivers and bin men and, guys with losing records, he generally won. He was generally able to knock these guys out. So going in against Larry Holmes, 52 years old, badly out of shape, that made the fight very, very intriguing as to how that fight would go, because it was a very, very difficult fight to call going in based on that, because Eric Esch, Butterbean, would be the kind of guy, if anybody at that level could go in there and set about Larry Holmes and overwhelm him quickly and basically put the nail in the coffin of his career, Butterbean was potentially a guy that could have done that. That was what made that fight very interesting. So, yeah, that's one of the more interesting freak show fights in boxing history. And for that reason alone, I actually like rewatching it. So, that fight happened. And it's actually very, very intriguing to watch, because what I'm going to say here, again, this might sound a little bit controversial. Some people might get annoyed by this, but I don't really care. My personal opinion, that fight may have been a sparring session. Now, what do I mean by this? Basically, if you look at the way that fight went, now I mentioned before, Butterbean is the kind of guy who was just a kamikaze. He would go in there, try to take your head off, throw everything at you, and either he gets you or you get him. He wasn't scared of getting knocked out. He got knocked out several times throughout his career, and he was always a guy who wore his heart on his shield and lay it all on the line. But at the same time, in between some of his pro fights, he did have some exhibitions. He had some fights that were staged. He had some fights where he would fight somebody who wasn't a boxer and he would just let them hit him and have fun with them and things like that. He wasn't above showmanship. He wasn't above WWE, put it that way. I mean, ironically enough, he actually did compete in WWE, but I digress. My point is, I personally think that fight was a sparring session. Larry Holmes, to me, in that fight, was just moving around, very, very slowly, I might add, on those 52-year-old legs, pecking away at Butterbean with the jab, just scoring points, not really putting anything behind it, not really throwing power punches. And likewise, Butterbean just kind of followed him around the ring, throwing one punch at a time, not really applying any pressure. The fight went 10 rounds, and despite Butterbean being a 4-round fighter who would gas over 4 rounds because of how many punches he would throw, he didn't gas over 10 rounds. He never looked anywhere near in trouble of getting stopped himself. So, me personally, I kind of think that freak show didn't go as the audience expected. I think it was kind of a scripted sparring session. I just kind of think the guys had an agreement not to hurt each other. That's all I'm saying. I think Butterbean probably thought to himself that it would be a bad look for him and very, very bad for his image if he went in there and just set about Larry Holmes, and it was like essentially, a senior citizen by that point. It wouldn't have been a good look. And I think likewise, Larry Holmes realised it wouldn't have been a good look for him and a good look for boxing if he went in there and just pulverised Butterbean and savagely knocked him out. A guy who was levels below him in terms of where he'd been at in his career. So, yeah, my long story short, it's a little bit of a tangent. I think that fight was fixed. I think it was a sparring session, but I digress. The reason why the fight intrigues me so much is just looking at Larry Holmes. The reason it intrigues me so much is because even at 52 years old, Larry Holmes was still able to slowly circle that ring and pump out the jab. And you could have imagined Larry Holmes continuing his career at that point. Like, even though he was so badly out of shape, that he was so overweight, and he was so lazy and lethargic at that stage of his career, he still had the kind of boxing IQ to move around the ring and box for 10 rounds, which is fascinating. I mean, there's not a lot of 52-year-old fighters that can do that. So, yeah, when I look at Larry Holmes' career, he wasn't the most consistent fighter. As I said earlier, like he was out of condition for some fights, he was very cocky for some fights, very lazy for some fights, very underprepared for some fights, and he lost to guys that he really shouldn't have lost to. I mean, he shouldn't be losing to guys like Michael Spinks. He shouldn't be getting knocked out early by Mike Tyson. Not a fighter of his level. I can forgive like the Holyfield fight and the Brian Nielsen fight and those levels of fights, because again, that's very, very late on in his career when he's in his 40s and when he's badly out of shape, and you could argue he shouldn't be fighting at that point. When this guy was in shape, when he was on form, when he was at his absolute prime, his absolute best, which I think was again, physically he was at his best, I'd say very late 70s, early 80s, but he did refine his boxing skills a bit into even the 90s and the early 2000s. But physically, he was definitely at his best back then. I think an argument can be made that he was one of the real innovators in the heavyweight division. I mean, with victories over the likes of Muhammad Ali, Ken Norton, Ernie Shavers, Tex Cobb, Jerry Cooney, Ray Mercer, James Smith, victories over several undefeated world-class contenders, guys who went on to be top contenders years later, having close fights late in his career, and arguably beating the likes of Oliver McCall and Brian Nielsen, some undefeated guys like that, and showing the kind of fluidity and the kind of boxing IQ in an era that you just didn't really see that kind of thing. I honestly think an argument could be made that this guy is the greatest heavyweight of all time. I would probably have him top 3, but that's a story for another day. I think this video's gone on long enough. Again, this is kind of an unstructured video. I wasn't really sure where I was going to go with this one, other than to say that I've always kind of had Larry Holmes as one of my best heavyweights of all time. And this is all off the top of my head. I just think that the guy is a very, very impressive fighter to go back and look at. And I would urge you guys to watch some of the early fights of his career. Again, go and watch the Ernie Shavers fight, because that was kind of his coming out party. That was where he really showed what he was made of. And go and watch the Tex Cobb fight as well, because I think that was kind of a more refined version of that performance against Ernie Shavers. The Randall Tex Cobb fight, that was one where I think he really showed his class in that fight. That was probably physically Larry Holmes at his absolute peak. So yeah, I think he's definitely a top 3 heavyweight. And yeah, let me know what you guys think anyway. Let me know if you want to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and God bless.